Donald Trump is heading back to the White House.
Together we can truly make America great again.
We are in for an unpredictable but fascinating 4 years.
And we're going to be following every twist and turn for the first 100 days. We'll be bringing you the latest updates and analysis first thing every morning. So join me, James Matthews.
Me, Martha Kellner.
And me, Mark Stone.
For Trump 100, every weekday at 6 a.m, wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, good morning and welcome to Politics with Sam and Anne, the podcast that gives you everything you need for the day ahead in British politics in under 20 minutes. We get you to 3% in a fraction of the time it takes the British government to get there.
And with a lot less fuss as well. It's Wednesday, February the 27th. I'm Anne McElvoy from Politico. With me is Sam Coates from Sky News. And we begin this morning with an apology.
Despite claiming to be a self-respecting podcast giving you everything you need to know about day ahead in British politics, 24 hours ago, we completely failed to tell you that there'd be effectively a relaunch of Keir Starmer's government on Tuesday. And I do think it is a relaunch, Anne. I was looking back at some of the earlier iterations of Keir Starmer's government, the Plan for Change document in December, for instance. Defence wasn't in one of the first 6 milestones. Previously in the summer, it wasn't part of the first 6 steps, nor is it a mission. Yes, it was one of December's 3 foundations, if you can even remember what they were, but blink and you miss it. And now it's the absolute centrepiece of Keir Starmer's government.
I love that you've been collecting these previous Labour guidelines, which now seem to mean rather little. Keir Starmer would argue things have changed, and if you didn't spot it, there's a new podium slogan too: secure at home, strong abroad, a new direction. Well, at least it was new to us and almost everyone else.
Yeah, it was quite interesting how, I mean, it wasn't just this podcast that didn't see it coming. It was nowhere 24 hours ago. I suppose some props to Robert Peston for being, I think, the only person to say firmly a rise in defence spending was coming this week. And a few weeks ago to the Sunday Times, who sort of put this, ran this up the flagpole saying that Keir Starmer might overrule Rachel Reeves on this. But shame on the rest of us, must do better. Although I have to say, talking to colleagues, political reporting colleagues yesterday, some of them are a bit sore. They feel that Number 10 was quite naughty at the weekend in what it was saying about how there definitely wouldn't be an announcement on defence spending this week. And I note gently there's a very grumpy line in the Times right through saying that Number 10 were actively briefing that there would be no announcement. So there we go, the Times calling the Number 10 team out hours before they get on a plane with them, presumably. Now, it is a pivot for Starmer. You just said it's because the facts have changed. That's true, but it's still a change from barely mentioning a defence in opposition to the security PM at the heart of European diplomatic community. It strikes me we get lots of iterations of Keir Starmer. There's the human rights lawyer. This one feels much more like the kind of cardboard cutout that Morgan McSweeney, his chief of staff, wants to see, a sort of blue Labour Keir Starmer vision. So, Anne, do you want to just start out by explaining what you think has just happened?
Absolutely fascinating, Sam, behind the scenes we hear. And maybe this accounts a bit for the cloak and dagger stuff from Number 10 that you're referring to there. And the story that the Politico has been running on this is that Keir Starmer needed something to start his visit to DC, that meeting with Donald Trump, and we know that the president is rather reactive mood with Europeans, and not his favourite part of the planet at the moment, and wanted to start there on a strong footing, and that the UK was basically told that in order to fulfil this bridge function with Europe, or whatever you want to call it, they would need to lift defence spending quickly, and being best in class, acting fast and paid for, you could say, almost in classic Trumpian style by slashing funds for international aid. That's gone down very well in Washington. And indeed, we sort of know that because there was a call moments after the news broke with Pete Hegseth, the US Defense Secretary, very close to Donald Trump, who told John Healey, his British counterpart, that this spending increase was excellent and a great leadership step. Now, of course, it is a pivot for a party that has attacked the Conservatives consistently for cutting foreign aid. And we hear that there are lots of angry emails dropping into MPs' inboxes yesterday. And a senior insider telling my colleagues that they suspect it's middle-class, educated, London-type voters who are getting worked up about this. So I don't know what you think about that, but it's to your point about Blue Labour, the influence of Morgan McSweeney, that's a very interesting way to put it, isn't it? You know, to sort of say, yes, people will be worked up, but they're only these college-educated urban voters. So that does seem to be the fight that the government is prepared to take on. But there'll be a lot of sore feeling among some I should say, core Labour voters about this. And I think there's a desire also not to have it voted on, not just to ram it through.
So yesterday's increase in defence spending was paid for by a pretty similar sort of reduction in the aid budget. Now, it's just worth saying, as Number 10 try and avoid any kind of vote on this, actually all our aid targets are set down in law. And if you do this, there is actually, I'm told by former Number 10 officials from the Tory era, a significant risk of judicial review, depending on exactly how the departure is phrased. So they're going to have to be a little bit careful on that. But this is part, I think, of a bigger picture and a bigger shift, really over about 20 years. At Sky, we got some fascinating polling from YouGov on all of this. Now, at the point of the election, Labour's proposition to the country was it was going to raise aid spending, international development spending, and actually it's gone ahead and cut it. Now, if you look at the polling, there's a headline polling. It's obvious from space why this is. It's backed by more than 2-1 in the public. You know, it's backed by Reform voters by 93% who are in favour of slashing aid in favour of military spending. But what's really interesting, Anne, and this is where the politics get quite juicy, is that although it's less popular with Labour voters, with people who put an X in the Labour box in last year's general election, actually still more people back it than don't who voted Labour. And I think this reflects a feeling that I have that in some senses Labour has a bit fallen out of love with international aid compared to those heydays in the Blair-Brown years where you had Tony Blair and Gordon Brown at those global summits pledging and really sort of inventing the 0.7% target and making it a global ambition. I feel that in the Labour movement more widely, there is a small minority that vocally push the idea that actually aid in a lot of senses is quite badly spent by Britain and that it doesn't necessarily do us a particularly large amount of assistance on the world stage. Yes, there is the embarrassment that David Lammy was trying to stop the US from reducing its aid budget just a matter of weeks ago. But there are many critics inside Labour of that self-same aid budget, particularly once aid was folded back into the Foreign Office under Dominic Raab and Boris Johnson, and exactly what that aid budget does these days is a lot more contentious and a lot less known. You've got this extraordinary statistic that 28% of it in 2023 went on refugees in donor countries and was spent by the Home Office, which, you know, is not saying that it's right or wrong, but is a madly high figure when you compare what international aid was probably meant for. But I do think there has been a falling out of love amongst a big minority of Labour folk for aid, which makes the politics of this much more possible. And remember, Keir Starmer didn't even have a Secretary of State for International Development or reinstate it as a government department when he came into power, as it was under the last Labour government. So this has been the trend for some time.
I think you're right about that. I mean, I think, certainly, I think psychologically you're right about where Team Keir sits on this, but I would just say, let's not forget that a lot of people who are around Keir Starmer in the key positions, in a way, sort of almost fit that caricature of these highly educated urban people who are going to get worked up about this. And they would include, for instance, Darren Jones, the Chief Secretary of the Treasury. Now, as it happens, I just happened to know that when constituents were contacting before the election, before the election and even after, about aid, he was like, well, we are very committed to this and it's something that matters to us, but of course we've got these spending constraints. And so the messaging previously was a bit more like, well, we're going to stick with this and we just have to make sure that we defend it in our spending strictures. And as you point out, really, now the message seems completely different. It's just, well, you can sacrifice this on the altar of higher defence spending because that's what the country needs, and let's put it on a big slogan. I do see quite a shift there, actually.
I suspect that Darren Jones, the Bristol politician, may have winced, but Darren Jones, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, will be glad that finding money for defence isn't having to come from other departmental budgets. Yeah. Other than the Foreign Office budget bit that deals with aid.
Do you think they are by any chance related?
Two people in the same man. Who knows? We'd have to ask him. All of this designed to help Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer flies off to Washington, I think, late afternoon, accompanied by a travelling press pack. David Lammy is going as well, but not on the same plane. I don't think Keir Starmer's wife is going on this trip, but it is possibly the most important foreign visit that Keir Starmer has done. I do wonder, Anne, whether or not it's the most important visitor that Donald Trump will receive this week. And I'm not referring to President Macron on Monday, but I am referring to President Zelensky, who is likely to turn up on Friday. President Zelensky looks like he's going to sign this deal over minerals between Ukraine and the US, which seems to be absolutely critical. You'll hear a lot about this today. It appears that the US have shifted. They've dropped their demand for $500 billion of compensation, and instead they're going to set up a joint US-Ukraine fund to manage future revenue, so there will be some money. But there are two big points you need to know about the minerals deal. The first is that the point of doing it from Ukraine's point of view is to sort of try and get US buy-in, more US buy-in than there's been towards Ukraine's security. But the deal, as far as we understand it, doesn't have specific security guarantees yet. There'll be a detailed agreement later, but nothing quite yet. So some analysts say there's less to this than meets the eye. But we'll see. I think there's no doubt having Zelensky in Washington is presentationally and politically helpful. But the other point is one being flagged by my excellent colleague Ed Conway, economics editor of Sky. He's doing it on a brilliant screen that's today. He's done it on the Daily Podcast as well with Neil Patterson. And he's making the point that actually there aren't these rare minerals in Ukraine. It's one of the more baffling elements of this story, that when you look at the international charts of rare minerals, Ukraine barely figures. Maybe there's a bit of lithium. Maybe Donald Trump just wants to go after the fossil fuel deposits in Ukraine. But this deal doesn't quite do what it says on the tin in either regard.
Right. Battle lines closer to home. We have seen the sudden departure of Amanda Pritchard as Chief Executive of NHS England, and that is the culmination of a standoff between the Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, and Pritchard about who really runs the NHS and reform priorities. So this has really come to quite a dramatic head. She is off. She says this is not really what she signed up for. But Wes Streeting thinks that there's duplication between the Department of Health and the bureaucracy that has been running it in England, and also with the individual hospital trusts. And they've had various to and fro and various arguments, I think, about how new initiatives should be delivered. But what we're seeing here, I think, Sam, is also the influence of Alan Milburn. Remember him? It's getting the Blair Band back together. He is back as lead non-executive at the Department Department of Health. And I think what he is saying, and Wes Streeting, I think, is very much aligned with this, is that there's going to have to be big change, both in terms of motivating and beefing up the NHS workforce, how you go about that, about technology and how you quickly get upskilled on all of that. But one of the big arguments is about who really gets to decide when, for instance, you want to move some budget to address shortages at the front line in A&E, etc. And that was a big argument between Pritchard and Streeting in the worst bit of the winter crisis, which always seems to strike the NHS as if it was unprepared for it. Who gets to decide? Can you move around the budgets to deal with that? She was unhappy that she felt big-footed by that, and probably quite a lot else as well. What do you reckon?
I find the departure of Amanda Pritchard after 3.5 years so fascinating on a number of levels. First of all, clearly, as you just laid out, that's because Wes Streeting is unhappy with the structure of the NHS, the relationship between NHS England and the department. Now, I am old enough to remember, Anne, when last year Wes Streeting said he wasn't going to do a reorganisation of all of this. It wasn't a problem of structural change. Now it looks like whoever succeeds Amanda Pritchard will be a lot closer to the Department for Health, that the job will effectively be in-house. It won't be this great big separate independent pillar as originally envisaged by Andrew Lansley. That separation is going to be, if not extinguished altogether, then blurred a lot more. I think that's interesting. It's probably right. It's just not what Wes Streeting was saying at the point of the election. And this leads to the second point, which is Wes Streeting has talked a great game on reform. We've just never known what it is. And the fact that it seems to slide around the place, I find interesting. He's often talked about as the Cabinet's greatest reformer, but he's also talked about how he didn't have a plan in his top drawer about what to do with the NHS, to which I always ask, why on earth not? So there is sort of change there. The final thing is I do think that one of the great frustrations was that the NHS got £22 billion in the budget in October. And according to reports, Wes Streeting wanted the NHS chief to basically say, look, that'll make sure that there isn't a winter crisis, and they wouldn't do that. And there's a question about whether or not the NHS does what and is capable of doing what Wes Streeting wants it to. And actually what he's doing is, by bringing stuff in-house, he'll just force them to say what he wants them to say, but it doesn't make the things he wants it to do any more achievable. So a big question mark about what it means in practice.
Absolutely. I mean, it's the running theme today, isn't it? A bit of what was said or signalled at the time of the election, or when Labour was coming into power, and what is turning out in reality to be the case. Not for nothing in the NHS are these moves known as redisorganisations. And one of the things we need to know is if Wes Streeting is going to take back this control, what is the plan? Because I've covered this sector for quite a long time, and what I'm hearing from a lot of people is, well, fine, it doesn't need to be the Amanda Pritchard way of doing it, but what is the Wes Streeting plan? What comes ahead of anything else? What are the steps? He now owns the problem. He has got the levers of power more firmly, as a result of which he owns the problem more.
We're going to have to move on. We've got about 2 minutes. I want to talk about this massive report today by the Committee on Climate Change, and apologies that it's so concertinaed, but it's one of those things that is going to have a big effect on our politics. Basically, there is an independent committee, independent-ish, appointed by government, that recommends ways that we can hit our individual climate targets at various years in the future in order to get to net zero by 2050. And it releases a report every so often with some relatively easy to hit targets and some relatively eye-watering targets. And what this one does is basically say that in order to hit your 2050 goal, that by 2040 you need to have got rid of 87% of the emissions that we had in 1990 by 2040. Now, that's fairly theoretical, but there are 3 tricky things to watch out for today. First of all, which is the perennial debate in environmental politics, which is that they say about a third of the emissions need to come from action by households, encourage people to get electric cars and encourage them to get heat pumps. You need to have that argument with the Treasury because people can't afford these things up front, but the Treasury doesn't want to fund them up front. And currently the private sector doesn't do that either. So that's big issue number one. Big issue number two, well, there's a lot of stuff in here about personal choice. It does say that eating less meat and less dairy and flying less will play a smaller but important role. That's what the committee says. In effect, flight costs must rise. Politicians hate throwing their weight behind that. Although I'm told that there's a little bit of wiggle room around aviation emissions that might give the government some assistance when it comes to Heathrow and Gatwick. Then the third big problem, and this is a bit of a sort of, this is hurting my head, is on farming, one of the biggest areas of emissions. It says that, look, we've basically got to give incentives to farmers and land managers to diversify away from meat and dairy consumption and allow the land to be released out of livestock production for alternative use, right? Now, what that means is the number of cattle and sheep must fall by 27% by 2040 compared to 2023 levels. They're killing a quarter of the sheep, or they're at least going to reduce livestock on farms by over a quarter. That is a hell of a message to our farmers in the week of the NFU conference. And I'd be surprised if this government throws its weight behind that.
Really interesting, and also we've seen that bad mood playing out in the past days between the farmers and the government. Another group sort of going off the government. Interesting take from The Guardian. Giving up 2 doner kebabs worth of meat a week will be enough to keep the UK within safe climate limits by the end of the decade. Choosing doner kebabs, which probably got more meat in them than any other the dish, but being pretty clear that you still need to get consumption down. As you point out, not a message the government likes to wrap its arms around. Doesn't want to tell us what we should put in our kebabs.
Keir Starmer, the vegetarian, cannot sell that message to the public. Right, this podcast will be back in 24 hours' time. Thank you very much indeed, and have a lovely few days. We'll see you soon.
See you soon.
Donald Trump is heading back to the White House.
Together we can truly make America great again.
We are in for an unpredictable but fascinating 4 years.
And we're going to be following every twist and turn for the first 100 days. We'll be bringing you the latest updates and analysis first thing every morning. So join me, James Matthews.
Me, Martha Kellner.
And me, Mark Stone.
For Trump 100 every weekday at 6 a.m, wherever you get your podcasts.